right, my AP language friends, Kristian Kuhn coming at you for another writing workshop, affectionately known as the Bob Ross of Composition. And as advertised and promised, I will be presenting all of the FRQs from 2015 to the present moment. And today on docket, we have FRQ 1 from the 2023 exam, which features the topic of vertical farming. Rather intriguing, rather interesting subject, but that's what the College Board went with. So what we're going to do during this writing workshop is this. I'm going to Bob Ross my instruction, as always, and I'm going to paint, and I'm using air quotes there. I'm going to paint a few introductions for you so that you get a sense of how to manipulate my declarative and inverted thesis heuristic. And then we'll jump into the body paragraphs and look at something that I call the syllogistic method. And that's the heuristic I use to construct the two body paragraphs. And then we will take a look at some conclusion stems to wrap the whole essay up. So without further ado, let's unpack this prompt real quickly and get a sense of what we're tasked to do for this particular essay. So it says, vertical farms are indoor agricultural facilities in which plants are grown, often in a hydroponic, soilless environment on tall stacks of shelves. So just a little contextual information there. Plants are given water, nutrients, and light mostly through automated processes. Advocates say that vertical farms are key to providing food for the future, yielding high-quality produce while making efficient use of land and water. Critics warn about the energy consumption associated with the vertical farms, automated processes, as well as problems related to cost and nutritional value, right? So this is typical fare for a synthesis essay. So clearly we're going to have to say yay to vertical farming, nay to vertical farming, or we're going to qualify it. So the rest of the prompt states, carefully read the following 6 sources, including the introductory information for each source. Write an essay that synthesizes material from at least, and this is the kicker, you got to listen to this and adhere to this, 3 of the sources and develops your position on the value, if any, of vertical farms to the future of agriculture. So again, thesis is going to say yes to vertical farming, no to vertical farming, or you can qualify it. And that's pretty much it. This is standard fare, average fodder as far as synthesis prompts goes. There's nothing really tricky about this one whatsoever. And that's, really indicative of most synthesis prompts. So I've already alluded to this. In order for this to make sense, I can't just assign it to you. I have to demonstrate how to write this essay. And that's what I mean by Bob Rossing my instruction. So Bob Ross used something known as heuristics, and his was the wet on wet technique, which is just basically the method, the technique he uses to make natural landscapes. So every time you see Bob Ross paint, he's manipulating the heuristic of the wet on wet technique. Every time you see me, in air quotes, paint or write essays, I'm likewise manipulating my heuristics of the declarative and inverted thesis and the syllogistic method. So sit tight. I'm going to walk you through the whole essay and I'll cobble it together bit by bit. And students, please follow along with me if you would like. All right. So the first question we have to ask ourselves is this. So how do I write the introductory paragraph? Because we got a big, fat, blank, empty canvas in front of us. So the first thing we could do is declare the thesis. And when you declare, you literally declare. So you begin with the thesis. So immediately out of the gate, we could drop our yes, no, qualify, right? So state the thesis. You got to sprinkle in a little bit of context and background, but here's what you absolutely do not want to do. So the College Board really necessitates that students keep their argument central. So don't regurgitate any of the sources. In fact, don't even mention any of the sources in the introductory paragraph. Just contextualize your stance, right? Whichever direction you go. Second, you want to also include some tier 2 level vocabulary. And what I mean by that is your average run-of-the-mill SAT level caliber words. I run intensive word study academies in my classroom so that my students really augment their vocabs exponentially over the course of the academic career, because there is a vocabulary void, right? And students need help to fill that. So that's my job. So I help them do that. Sentence constructs is also very important. I want all of my students to be in contention of the elusive unicorn sophistication point. And this comes down to sentence constructs a tad bit. It's really important. Struggling emerging writers will often overuse independent clauses and short, simple declarative sentences. So you create that droning rhythm of da 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 da. So I want better musicality. So my students go through my Nuance Academy and they learn Strunk and White's rule number 18, in which they assert that there's 12 different sentence types. So there's 12 different ways to cobble together a single sentence. But then you can pattern those types 20 different ways. So my guys are syntactical ninjas after they go through my Nuance Academy, and can make some pretty intelligent choices at sentence level to cop that voice rhythm and flow necessary for the sophistication point. And the big kicker is this: it is exactly 4 sentences long, right? So with practice, you can crank these 4 sentences really easily. It just becomes kind of instinctual, habitual, and you're going to do it for all of the FRQs on the Lang exam and the lit exam. So it just becomes kind of second nature. All right, so that's the declarative. We can flip that over on its head. Notice my triangles are upside down, and you can invert the thesis. In this case, you just end with the thesis. So you'll begin with your context background. Sometimes kids get, poetic and try to do a hook or an analogy, which is totally unnecessary in time situations. I know personally for myself, the muse ain't there some days, and I got nothing poetic to say. So you just be academic, right? Tier 2 vocab, sentence constructs, 4 sentences. It does not matter if you declare or you invert. So let's unpack that. So I did a lot of talking into the ether. Let's unpack it and take a look at exemplar number 1 to see what this looks like on paper. So I'll read it and then I'll unpack it. There is a certain incontestable truth that speaks to the absolute necessity of pursuing vertical farming more stridently. While arable land is decreasing, the world's population is on the rise. The bottom line is this: Mother Earth simply cannot continue to feed all of her children at the current rate. Something radical must be done to ensure that the citizens of the world have enough food to survive, and these agricultural measures are a certain solution. While the critics of these measures offer up a few valid points, the benefits far outweigh the negatives. All right, so this is a quintessential declarative thesis. So you can see in that first sentence, I've laid my stance. You know the direction that I'm going. It's kind of like a compass to a map, right? So my thesis is there. I've also given acknowledgement, kind of a nod of the hat to my opposition in that last line, where I say, while the critics, I like it when my students do that because there is an opposing viewpoint here. Other people have a totally different opinion than me, and I do need to acknowledge that. And in my paper, I'm going to need to do some concessions and some rebuttals and things of that nature, which I'll demonstrate in just a little bit. My vocab is up. There's like some really nice verbiage in here: incontestable, necessity, stridently. So words like that constitute tier 2, and you don't want to overdo it. You don't want to goon out, sound contrived or pretentious, but it does need to be elevated because it's an academic paper. I'm in my wheelhouse. I'm in my lane. It sounds natural. But look at the sentence constructs. I'm doing some things in here that are pretty cool. I used a colon, I used a dash, and none of the sentences parallel each other. That's kind of the bit of advice that I give my students. Look at the sentence you just dropped and don't parallel it again in the introduction. Otherwise, you're going to get a droning rhythm, a droning tone. So that might be a tad bit confusing. You might be scratching your head. So let's paint another one. Let's see exemplar number 2 and how I approach it. Again, I'll just read it and then I'll unpack it. If one is to embrace vertical farming as the panacea to our world's food shortage crisis, they are ignorantly placing their blind faith in a science that renders human beings into veritable guinea pigs. Sounds like a thesis to me, right? That's definitely declarative. My stance is firmly planted. Under no circumstances whatsoever should food cultivated in these manners be made accessible to the public without first knowing the ramifications on health, if any at all. All too often, there are claims to trust the science, but the vertical farming proponents need to pump their brakes and exercise a bit of prudence. Not only is there a litany of unknowns, but even from a fiscal standpoint, pursuing these alternative growth options makes zero logical sense. So I found in writing this, and teachers that are watching this, this is kind of a lesson learned. I found in writing these, it was very easy for me to declare, principally because the prompt gave so much background information. It really demystified what vertical farming is. So there's no point in students to belabor and define what vertical farming is. I found it easy just to jump right in and hit my reader with a thesis. So that was just, the benefit of Bob Rossing my instruction. I can give that little tidbit of information to my students, but they can go either way. It doesn't matter. So you can see I'm doing the same things in here. I took an opposing viewpoint from the first one, but here's something that I like about this, and I wanted to demonstrate this for my students. I'm a firm believer that in order to get the sophistication point, you got to be, a master of the punctuation, the grammar, the syntax. Your analysis needs to be killer. You need to line up your line of reasoning, all that stuff. But one little element of this is the ability to teeter-totter the tier 2 with just a wee bit of vernacular and colloquial. So I like expressions in here like veritable guinea pigs. And I also like the proponents need to pump their brakes. That's what I mean by colloquial vernacular, just some street expression in there, a little bit, right? I think it gives kids personality. I think it gives them some spunkiness and some flair and some pizzazz. And I like it when my students do that, especially in the synthesis paper. This is a paper in which you can exercise your voice and show your personality because it's straight up argumentation. So nothing different in this one. 4 sentences, vocab up, sentence structures are a flowing and supple. And I definitely have articulated a thesis in the declarative paradigm. All right, my students, you can do this. It's actually pretty easy. I think synthesis is probably the easiest expository mode. It's really kind of straight up. So let me really simplify it and go basic on this last one. If anyone's struggling, use this as your exemplar. Again, I'll read it and then I'll unpack it. It is abundantly clear that our earth and its people are in peril. That doesn't sound like a thesis statement. That's context and background. So I'm inverting on this one. But thankfully, human development and scientific development has an answer to pull us forth from the brink of disaster and collapse. Clearly, man cannot survive without adequate food resources. But the truth of the matter is that we have exhausted our natural resources, while populations nonetheless continue to rise. This last sentence has to be my thesis. I have to kind of get a yay, a nay, or a qualification. As such, science needs to vigorously investigate the viability of vertical farming. And that really kind of gets at the essential question of the prompt. Again, 4 sentences, vocab's up. My sentence structures are pretty basic in this one, but they're varied enough, right? They're not wowing me. They're not really, syntactical ninja kind of stuff, but it gets the job done and there's no repetition. There's no parallelism in this whatsoever. All right, friends, students, if you want to write along with me, good place to pause and give it a whirl. Try your hand at either a declarative or inverted. Share your writing with your peers. I'm convinced that the more people view your writing, the more eyes you get on it, and the more eyes you get on other students' writing, the better you become, right? See more, be more. But we have a ton of blank canvas still ahead of us. We have to ask ourselves, so how do I write the body paragraphs? And as advertised, every FRQ, literally every essay you ever write going forward, the body paragraphs can be done syllogistically. That's why I love this heuristic. You can use it across the expository modes. So let me give you a little bit of context and background about it, a little brief historical overview. It's rooted in the Aristotelian tradition. Aristotle thunked it up. He ran a school called the Lyceum, and the town's boys would go there to learn about polemics, oration, debate, wordsmithing, word wrangling, and they would throw out their own juicy essential questions. And if you ever read a book called Plato's Republic, the essential question is, what is justice? So the scholars, the philosophical think tankers would step to the proverbial mic and they would drop their definition of what justice is. And Aristotle, just like your composition instructors, just like myself, would say, wow, some kids argue like exceptionally well. Some are men. Some just can't like hold it together. And ultimately, what he was concerned with was line of reasoning, just like us composition instructors. And he carefully studied the inner machinations of the brains of the really good orators. And he had a eureka moment. He said, aha, those really good arguers are arguing syllogistically, which just means that they have like a mathematical, computative, calculative approach to the argument to sustain the line of reasoning. And Aristotle's word for that was cogency, just to be locked in. So I'll give you an example. You go premise, premise, conclusion. It's like a math formula. And if I were to tell you in premise 1, arsenic is deadly, you'd nod your head and say, yep, Kristian, that's 100% true. But then if I follow it up by premise 2 and say, my dog ate arsenic, you're naturally going to conclude, uh-oh, Kristian, that's not going to bode well for your dog. Your dog's most likely going to die. And we would call that logic. That's reasoning. It's very rational. And when you write, you got to be that bulletproof. So how do we take Aristotle's heuristic and morph it into a heuristic for the purposes of performing synthesis? It looks like this. The first premise is going to be an argument containing a why reason. And this is important. And let me explain it this way. This is like the simplest way that I can explain it. Up top in the thesis, we say yes, no, or maybe. We qualify. But we don't get into the why. Right? We don't belabor the why. You're going to take 3 sentences in the first body paragraph and drop your why reason. So old school College Board used to say, your argument must be central over and over and over again. To keep the centrality of the argument, you don't want to be quoting or paraphrasing or piggybacking any of the sources up top in sentence 1, 2, or 3. Otherwise, you lose the centrality of the argument. You must argue, right? Otherwise, you're doing regurgitation or plot synopsis, like a Cliff Note summary of the sources, and you got waylaid from your own argument. So I like 3 sentences just as like a safety guard. So the 4th sentence begins the second premise, and we're going to teeter-totter balance the quoting and the paraphrasing. We know we need to use 3 sources according to the directions. So I'll show you how to embed those quotes and balance out the quoting and the paraphrasing. And then we also need to be mindful of the fact that body paragraphs need to be concluded. So in the conclusion of the body paragraph, the conclusion of the syllogism, we're going to link, echo, and promise back to the prompt, the thesis, and the first premise. So a syllogism ultimately comes full circle upon itself. So you might be asking yourselves, all right, Kristian, you've talked into the ether. How do I write that first premise? Well, it's actually pretty easy. And I got some training wheels for this one because I'm not sure, students, where you're at in your development in terms of writing synthesis, but I know early in the academic year, my students need some scaffolds and training wheels for this to make sense. I'm not a big fan of sentence stems. And if you use these two sentence stems, don't use them permanently, right? Because it's kind of artificial and it's not like the most organic thing to do in terms of composition. But if you're stuck, right, if you're stumped in terms of articulating a why reason, this is what you can say. There's a clear reason as to why. By virtue of saying reason why, you're going to drop the reason why in your next few sentences. But if you got a couple of things that you're going to focus on, you could say there are a couple of reasons why the vertical farming should, or whatever it is you want to say about vertical farming. So let me show you a first premise with that stem, the whole thing fleshed out, all three sentences. So there are several reasons why the vertical farming proponents need to exercise a greater degree of prudence. First, the scientific community and key researchers have no idea whatsoever if consuming this food is even safe to eat. Second, the fiscal and environmental costs nullify all possible benefits. All right, so we got to talk about line of reasoning here. A first premise is a promise. And I did something called the enumerated approach in this. Do you see how I said first, second? I like this, and my students like to use this device too. Because it keeps the line of reasoning very intact. So in the first, I'm focusing on the fact that consuming this food may potentially not be safe. So I need to go get quotes and or paraphrases about food safety. And then if you look at where it says second, I'm focusing on fiscal and environmental issues. So now I got to go get quotes and or paraphrases for that. Well, this is cool because if you add up the math of a syllogism, you're shooting for 10 to 12 sentences, right? In order to get all of your support, all your analysis in there to keep the centralized argument, it's going to take 10 to 12 sentences. So I'm 3 sentences in. Let's just recap that. The first 3 sentences, you got to argue your why reason. Next, I always do this when I'm done with my first premise. I go quote hunting. I have a promise in that first premise. I need things about safety, environment, economy. Quotes and or paraphrases for those 3 things. And if I do that, I'm keeping the promise of the first premise. I therefore will have a very tightly constructed line of reasoning. And I also will be, as Aristotle said, cogent. So let's look at the second premise and see where I go. So usually fourth sentence, I start quoting and paraphrasing, right? Because I've already stated my argument. I've given you my why reason. I don't need to belabor it. Get into the sources, fourth sentence. So here is my second premise. While wide-eyed pundits champion vertical farming as producing tomatoes with enough tang to impress Martha Stewart, the fact of the matter is that no one yet knows if there are any health ramifications from eating such produce. Source A. All right, let's talk about this. Remember I talked about safety? So my first quote needs to be a safety quote. That's the best quote I could find to get at the heart of safety. My line of reasoning is intact. I'm also doing something called the 5-word rule. If students often don't know how to embed their quotes and keep things conversational, and there's an easy hack for that. It's kind of a cheat code. If you place a minimum of 5 words in front of the quote, it typically works. A minimum of 5 words, and keep the quote relatively small, bracket as needed. It should sound conversational, right? So let's see. I quoted, I have to analyze it. So look where I go out of source A. It is clear that the world's population is projected to exceed 9.5 million people by the year 2000 or 2050, source F. And it is also clear that arable land availability is decreasing over time. Vertical farming is not the panacea to these pressing problems. There are far too many unknowns. And as Kim Severson asked, what will the health outcomes be in 2 generations? Source A. All right, so I'm kind of weaving my sources together a little bit here. And again, I'm focusing on the safety. I still have that second promise that I made in the first premise. So I got to get to that. The answer is simple and frightening. Nobody knows because the science is lacking in perhaps the most critical arena, research on human impact. Expecting unsuspecting citizens to be rats for a huge live experiment is neither good science nor is it ethical. All right, I'm going to continue. I'm out of space here in this slide. So my second premise still continues onto the next slide. So hop over with me. The pros and cons are numerous, and while it is clear that vertical farming uses much less land than traditional methods, and that vertical farms can be built in desert, high population urban areas, and other places that traditional open field farming, it is clear that this all comes with great cost. Source B. I like what I'm doing here. You have to acknowledge the opposition, right? It cannot just be 100% you bulldoze in your argument over your reader. You have to acknowledge the opposition, offer concessions, offer rebuttals within this paper. A simple truism of life is that it requires sunlight. But as paradoxical as it may sound, they're trying to use the sun to replace the sun, which is crazy expensive and environmentally counterproductive. Source D. Remember how I talked about economy and environment? That was the best quote for that from source D. So you got to quote and paraphrase with absolute deliberation. Ever since the beginning of the most basic farming methods, the sun has been free of cost and proven to work really well. So why try to fix it? Source C spells it out clearly. The cost of traditional farming are very low, while the cost of vertical farming are very high. All right, so I did it all there. I got safety, economy, environment, right? That's everything that I promised. But I'm not done. I got to wrap this all up, right? I got to conclude the thought. So look at how I do this. Usually the conclusion of a body paragraph takes like 1 or 2 sentences. That's it. Just wrap it up real quick. Get back to the prompt. Get back to the thesis. Not until this science reveals its science in terms of impact on mankind, it quite simply is not a viable alternative or option. Further, the economic costs likewise cancel out any perceivable benefits. It's not worth it on so many levels. And that, my friends of AP language and composition, is how you would do a body paragraph for synthesis, right? So let's talk about this. What do you do next, right? Because you just can't write an intro in one body and call it a day. What do you do next? The answer might surprise you. You bust out another syllogism. So there's still more things we got to do. Concessions, rebuttals, right? Just totally annihilate the opposition with good hardcore evidence, facts, data, statistics, research, and have at it. There's still other sources that we haven't used to bolster our argument, and there's still other, sides of the rock of our stone of the argument that we haven't explored. So you're going to reload that first premise, make it 3 sentences, change the why reason. Second premise, change the quotes. Don't over rely on one particular source. Know, according to the directions, that you got to use 3, which I already did in that first syllogism. You're shooting for 10 to 12 sentences. Remember to wrap it up at the end and you're good to go. So I want you to do that second paragraph all on your lonesomes and have your teachers look over your shoulder, have your friends look over your shoulder as well, and give it a whirl. We still have to wrap the essay up. So it's going to be 4 paragraphs: intro, 2 bodies, conclusion. And with my students early in the academic year, as we're learning how to do synthesis, and really any essay, I give them some conclusion stems. Come exam time, I really don't want my students doing contrived things like sentence stems. I'm not a big fan of it. You can get a little bit more organic and original and authentic without using stems. But hey, if you're new at this, use a stem, right? I'm all about training wheels and scaffolds until you gain your own independence and you can fly on your own. So here are a few sentence stems. My conclusion paragraphs typically take 3 to 4 sentences, and I equate it to the grand finale of a fireworks display, right? Big bang, focus on theme, focus on the big concepts, and you can wrap it all up like this. Simply said, evidentially, in no other words, when it is all said and done, at the end of the day. So give that a try, my students, and see how it goes. And have fun with it. So I think I set you up to tackle this to be quite successful. So happy teaching, happy writing. I'm at the end. If you have any questions, comments, concerns, or even want me to look over your shoulder, I'm always willing to help students out. Drop me a line at teachingwritingcoach@gmail.com. Also note, I'm a lead teacher for the National Writing Project, present often for NCTE, Perfection Learning, even the College Board. So you can see my calendar of events at teachinghowtowrite.com, and most of the PD is free. Some are for a nominal fee, so teachers, if you want to hop on board and see what's going on, come see. Students, I have my own tutoring company that I call Write at Ivy Write. I've helped thousands of students get into really good schools by coaching them how to write their college personal statements. I'm really expert on that. So if you want help with that, or if you want to crush your AP exams, hook me up, drop me an email, and we'll talk shop. So that's it from here. As I said, I'll be going all the way back to 2015 for all 3 FRQs for Lang and Lit. So I got some yeoman's work ahead of me. I gotta get busy and record these and get them out there for the world to see, my heuristics. So be well, and I'll see you at the next writing workshop.